Amen. So this is the season of Advent, and each day, each week, each Sunday, we're going to light a new candle, and it's going to be hope, peace, love, and then joy. And then on Christmas Eve, by the way, we're going to have a Christmas Eve service this year. What? But that's only because it's on Sunday. So yeah, it's a Christmas Eve morning service, and then on Christmas Eve morning, we will light the Christ candle. But this morning, we light the candle of hope, as we recognize that Jesus is the hope of the world. And that's not true just of Christianity. It's Christianity that recognizes that, but it's true of the world, whether people recognize that or not. In fact, actually, as of late, there has been an increasing fear among Christians that people go, Josh, you know what they're trying to do. Like what? What are they trying to do? They're trying to take the Christ out of Christmas. And they're like, oh, like what? Like, yeah, like everywhere you go, it's happy holidays. And they're trying to take the Christ out of Christmas. And I go, no way. And I go, yeah, way. And I go, well, here's the crazy thing about that. Actually, so that trend to take the Christ out of Christmas, we can actually trace that back. I can trace it back. We can trace it back probably about 2,000 years to King Herod. He was the first one who tried to take the Christ out of Christmas. Literally take the Christ out of Christmas, right? He heard that this king was born. And so when the wise men came to him, they said, we've heard that, which is where they would have gone. They would have said, hey, we heard a king was born. Congratulations. And he would have been like, I had no son born recently. And then King Herod says, well, go find this king. And when you do, bring back report so that I too can worship him. And he doesn't want to worship him. He wants to kill him, as then is evident by the events that follow that. So he was the first one that we know of that tried to take the Christ out of Christmas. And as we are here this morning, he was not successful in that. And my guess is that the latest iteration of that desire to take the Christ out of Christmas also will be ineffective when history remembers us. And the reason why is because we're not the ones that put the Christ in Christmas, right? Only the one that put the Christ in Christmas is the one that could take the Christ out of Christmas, and that's God himself. And so unless he's going to do that, which, spoiler alert, he's not going to do that, then it's not going to happen. And so here we are, we're this Advent, and we know that Jesus is the hope of the world. And really the hope, if you've been here at all at Northside for any number of years, is that you may know that the way that I've defined hope is the waiting in anticipation and expectation for God to deliver on his promises. And if that doesn't sound new to you, good, I'm glad. I go, yeah, that's what that is. It's the hope is the waiting in anticipation and the expectation for God to deliver on his promises. By the way, this is why hope and faith go together, right? Faith is the act of belief in the trust and the promises of God. Faith says, God, you've made some promises, and I'm going to make decisions based on those promises. And then hope says, and then I wait in anticipation and expectation for those promises to come to fruition. This is why hope and faith, they work together. But notice that how both faith and hope are rooted where? In the promises of God. Right? They don't exist in a vacuum. People will even tell you, like, you have to have more hope, man. You're hopeless. You have to have more hope. And then, but somebody can say, but why? In what ought I to have hope in? They go, well, you have to have hope in that I don't know, that things will get better, right? That's the idea. Well, actually, so that things to get better, that's in some sort of sense, that's a promise that things will get better. Because, but what if they don't? Well, then you are rightfully hopeless? No. And so really, that hope and faith always have to have an anchor, and that anchor is some sort of promise. Now, those who have faith and hope in God believe that those promises are anchored in God himself, right? And so even when we think about this idea of hope, so that this hope, this Advent, as we celebrate this Advent, is this idea that Jesus was born into this world. But Jesus, right, he was the answer to so many prophecies. I mean, you read Isaiah, you go back as far back as Genesis, but really Isaiah, there's so many prophecies about the Messiah in Isaiah. 700 years before Jesus shows up, all of these prophecies, the prophecies a lot of times that you hear quoted during Christmas come from Isaiah. 700 years, twice as long as we've been around as a nation, more than twice as long as we've been around as a nation, the promises of God were spoken before they came to fruition. And those people, they had hope. So much so that when Jesus shows up, what do they say? Are you the one? Are you the one we've been waiting for so many hundreds of years for, right? This is even what John says. Or should we keep on looking? Are you the fulfillment? And what Corinthians tells us is that yes, that Jesus is. Jesus is all of the answers are yes and amen in him. He's the answer to all of the promises of God. And so this Advent says that they were waiting in anticipation and expectation for God to deliver on his promises, and that was for the Messiah to show up. Notice that when Jesus shows up on the scene, he's not like, hey, I'm the Messiah. Like, oh, okay, great. Like, we don't, I'm sorry, who? Come again? Who are you? I'm the Messiah. Oh, okay, great. And why are you here? Like, I'm here to deliver you and to save you. Okay. Like, I mean, they were waiting, and they knew. They're like, oh my gosh, he's here. We've waited so long for him to come because we knew that God was going to deliver on his promises. That's the first Advent. We sit now between the two Advents, right? There's the second Advent, the blessed hope, that we believe that Jesus is going to return. 2,000 years have gone by. Jesus says, I'm going to come back. And 2,000 years have gone by, and here we are as a church, and we are waiting in anticipation and expectation that Jesus shows up. And have you noticed, the worse things get, the more we long for him to show up. Oh, may it be before the election in November, right? May it be before the end of the year. May it be now, may it be today, may it be even before the sermon is done. So now we sit between these two. The darker things get, the more we need hope. You know, you think about something like despair. Despair says things aren't going to get better. Hope says that they will. And it's interesting, when you look into the future, both are rooted in the future, hope and despair. Hope says that things will get better. But why do we believe that? Well, we believe that because there's a God who says that he's coming again. And so if we're going to root this idea of hope in the promises of God, I think first the question becomes, then what are some of the promises of God, right? Because sometimes I will meet with people, I'll talk with people, I'll listen to something on on a podcast or YouTube that people are talking about God, and they'll say, and then God said, and then they'll give a promise, and I go, oh no, he did not promise that. He did not promise that. And now people are hearing this, and they're building their life on a promise that I don't believe he ever gave. God said that no harm would ever come your way if you're one of his children. False. That is not true. Do not build your life on that promise, because that's not, in fact, actually Jesus says the opposite, right? If you come after me, you got to pick up your cross. So what we want to do, what I want to do, even as a pastor and as a follower of Jesus, I want to build my life in the promises of God. And then I expect God to deliver on those promises. So if you've got your Bible, we're going to look at a few promises this morning. But let's look at Psalm 27. This is a psalm from David, somebody who knew what it was like to hope and wait in anticipation and expectation for God to deliver on his promises. He says this in Psalm 27, verse 1, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" Let me say it again. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? And so he says, God saves me, right? He's my salvation, and he shelters me. He's my stronghold, right? It's interesting because a lot of people think that this idea that God's saving his people, that's a New Testament idea, right? Oh, that's, God condemns in the Old Testament. He's so angry in the Old Testament. He's so mad. He's so vengeful and spiteful in the Old Testament. Then he chills out for a few hundred years, and then the New Testament comes and goes, yeah, maybe they're not as bad as I thought they were, and let me save them. Maybe they're worth saving. And that's not true. From Genesis, from the very beginning of the Bible, the seeds of salvation are being sown. And so here David goes, hey, so God, you are the one who saves me, and you're the one who shelters me. And by the way, David would have known this story. God, you read David's story. God, he finds himself in peril, but then many times, supernaturally, David himself is saved by God. He says, you're my salvation, and you are my shelter. He shelters his people. I mean, you think about Israel coming out of Egypt. Right? Not only did God save them, right? He brought them out of Egypt, out of slavery, into the promised land. But you read the stories of Exodus. What does he also do? He shelters them. They comfort him. They run to him. He comforts them. He cares for them. He provides for them. In the day of trouble, you know what you need in the day of trouble? What you need in the day of trouble is you need both this idea of salvation and sheltering. And the psalmist says that I come to you for both. You know, you've maybe heard me say this before, but where you run to in the day of trouble tells me where you think your comfort lies and what your salvation lies. Right? You know, man, day of trouble, I'm going to run to that relationship. Well, you think that relationship will save you and comfort you. And sometimes there's some comforting in that. You run to your material possessions. The day of trouble, do I have enough money in the account? I run to that. I got to go check the bank account because that's where my salvation lies. That's what my money will save me and it will comfort me. I mean, you think about any major economic downturn we've had. You go, check the 401ks. Okay, I'm going to be okay now. Okay, because there's enough money in that account. You run there. Why? Because you think that's what will save you, and you think that's what will comfort you. Or you see it go down, all of a sudden you're anxious, no longer hopeful about the future. Uh-oh. And listen to what he says. Because you're where my salvation lies, your salvation comes from you, God, and sheltering comes from you, God. Because those two things are true, I will not fear. There are two emotions, I think, often that we when we think about the future that stir up in us. The two emotions here are hope and fear. I don't think that the opposite of hope or the enemy of hope is necessarily despair. I think that's an outcome. I think the enemy of hope is fear. It's a fear that leads to despair. But really, I think the enemy of hope is fear. Let me ask you this. When you think about the future, are you hopeful or fearful? Now, there's fearful if there's something sort of I'm hopeful if there's something I'm looking forward to that I'm super excited that it's going to come. There's an anticipation of a day of victory, like, oh, this victory's coming, I'm super hopeful. But a lot of times I think what we do is we look into the future and all we have is fear. And we think we could look into the future and not be so fearful if I was in my current status, like more stable. If I had shelter and comforting here. And it's interesting. What would it take for you to look to the future and not be fearful, but be hopeful? I mean, if we're just being honest, a lot of times it's the fact that God is our salvation and that God is our shelter is pretty far down on that list. It's like, as long as my kids are okay, as long as I have the house, as long as the car is there, as long as the bank account's fine, then I could look into the future and not be so fearful. I could look into the future and be hopeful. You go, well, but Josh, the wrong people are in office, the wrong policies are going through. I go, yeah. See, that's because your future is rooted in something other than the salvation and sheltering of God himself. Man, Josh, you look into the future and be hopeful? Yes. I mean, have you seen our country? Oh, yeah. No, I have. It's not great. But have you seen our God? Have you seen our policies, Josh? Have you seen the economy? Have you seen any of that, Josh? Have you even looked at inflation lately? I mean, have you seen those things? I go, yes. But your hopefulness, Christian, and the future is not rooted in our economy, people, or policies. Not even our country. Your hopefulness of the future is rooted in a God who delivers on his promises. And so he says, I'm not going to fear. This is what he says, right? Who am I going to fear? And so he says, I'm not going to fear. Do you know why often we look into the future fearful? It's because we often look into the future as if God does nothing, right? And hear me on this. If we move into a future where God does not act, we ought to all be fearful, right? If we looked into a future where God did not deliver on his promises, we would be fools for being hopeful. And we ought to be fearful for the things to come, right? But the reason, both by personally and like collectively as Christians, we look into the future fearfully because we look into a future as if God does nothing. You try that with your marriage. I'm just thinking about the future. I'm a little fearful. Like, why? Because I'm assuming that you're going to be just a lump on a log and do nothing. Like, wait, what? Yeah, I'm looking to the future, and I just assume that you're just going to be a loaf and do nothing. I'm going to do what I promised I was going to do. Well, we'll see about that. And until you do that, I'm just going to assume that you won't. And I go, but this is often Christians do this. And I'm saying this because right now Christians are some of the most fearful people that I talk to. And they go, but have you seen the trajectory? Going back to, have you seen the trajectory of our economy? Have you seen the trajectory of the world? Have you seen the trajectory of our country? I go, yeah, but you keep on looking at those trajectories, and the reason why they never play out the way that you think they're going to play out is because nowhere in there, that trajectory, does it account for what God's going to do. And he says, God, look, I look into my future. And God, I know you're going to save me, and I know you're going to shelter me. So, who am I going to be afraid of? It goes on in verse 2 and 3. He says, when evildoers assail me and eat up my flesh, my adversaries and foes, it is they who stumble and fall. Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war rise against me, yet I will be confident. And so he says, when the enemy encamps around me, they're trying to eat up my flesh, they're trying to consume me, it's them who are going to stumble and fall. Then though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war arise against me, yet I will be confident. Notice how he says, so the army encamps around me. I'm going to be confident. And then the war arises around me. And he says, and I'm going to be confident. I'm not going to fear when the enemy encamps me, and I'll remain confident when war arises. Enemy encamps, war rises. This is this idea that it goes from bad to worse. I mean, it's terrible, isn't it? The enemy has encamped around me. But then it goes from worse to where it says, and now the wars are rising. But even both of those places, I will remain confident. Have you ever, something's not going well, and you started praying, and you start praying, and then it goes from bad to worse? This is probably only I've ever experienced that, right? That's just me. Okay, so you pray for something, it's bad. All right, okay, Lord, all right. It goes bad, like game on, but prayer. And you start praying, and then the next thing you know, it goes from bad to worse. You know one of the thoughts that comes to your mind? then why did I even pray? Like, why did I go? What was that all about? Like, I just, God. And someone's like, you need to trust in the Lord. You're like, hey, so here's the thing. I already tried that. I did that, and then guess what happened? It just it got worse. But what he says here is that when it goes from bad to worse, he doesn't abandon God. He still remains confident. Even though, God, I'm praying to you, the army has encamped, but now I keep on praying. Now war arises. I still trust in you. I am no less confident that you will shelter me and you will save me than I was when there were no enemies around me. And so he says, even this bad to worse, God, I trust in you. Verse 4. The one thing I've asked of the Lord that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. For he will hide me in his shelter. See this again? He will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will lift me high upon the rock, and my head shall not be lifted up above my enemies all around me. And now my head will be lifted up above all my enemies around me. And I will offer in his tent sacrifices with shouts of joy. I will sing and make a medley to the Lord. So he says, there's one thing that I ask for. The one thing I've asked of the Lord. There's one thing I've asked for him. We play this game. If you could ask God for one thing, what would it be? If you could ask God for one thing, what would it be? $1 billion? No, $1 billion. $1 billion. That would be great. What would you ask him for? I'd ask for him to restore this relationship. I'd ask for him to get a new job or a new boss. I'd ask for the new car. I'd ask for the house. I'd ask for all of these things. But the psalmist says, I could ask for one thing. The army has encamped and war is arising. If I ask for God for one thing, what do I ask for him? I ask for him. Right? That's what he says. If the one thing I ask the Lord that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all of the days of my life. That's it. That's all that I want. Because I want him. I think often the mistake that we make as Christians, especially in regards to hope, is that we long more for the provision than the provider. Right? I think that most Christians, I'm sure none of you in this room, but most Christians, the way that we approach Christianity or our relationship with God is that he kind of does stuff for us, we do some things for him, but for the most part, he just kind of leaves us alone, right? He just kind of we don't really bother him unless it's like really big deal, and he doesn't really bother us unless we're like really messing up, and other than that, he just kind of leaves us alone. But that's a terrible view of God. That's a terrible view of the relationship that God is offering you through Jesus. Right? This is the idea. It's like, man, if I got God, I could dwell with you in the house of the Lord, like all of my days of my life. By the way, this goes back to Genesis 1 and 2, where God had created the world. He put Adam and Eve into the garden, and he dwelled among them. He was among them. That's what we're after. That's where we're going back to. When we talk about Revelation, the end of Revelation, what are we going back to? What's happening? I think we return to an Eden-like state where God's with us and we're with him. And there's no shame, there's no guilt. It's just, everything is as it ought to be. Because that's what I want. I could dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. Why? Because God, this is what he says. Why do I want that? Because God, you're the one you're the one who will shelter me, and you're the one who will save me. That's what he says, right? Verse 5, that you would hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble, that he will conceal me under the cover of his tent. That's that you will shelter me. And then verse 6, and now my head shall be lifted up above my enemies. That's the saving. But notice what happens here. He goes, God, I seek after you because you're the one who will save me and you're the one who will shelter me. And then in verse 6, he says, and then I will offer in his tent sacrifices and with shouts of joy. In other words, and his response then is worship. You see what happens here? He goes, God, in the day of trouble, I hope in you because you're going to do what you said you're going to do. So I'm asking you to save me, and I'm asking you to shelter me. And when those things take place, my response to you is worship. And so too often I think that what happens is that God saves us and shelters us, and then we go right about life. And the psalmist says, I'm not going to do that. I'll respond in worship. And look what he says in verse 7. Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud, be gracious to me and answer me. You have said, seek my face. My heart says to you, your face, Lord, do I seek. Hide not your face from me. Turn not your servant away in anger. O you who have been my help, cast me not off, forsake me not, O God of my salvation. For my father and my mother have forsaken me, but the Lord will take me in. I love this. Because what the psalmist does here, you see what he does? He reminds God of his promises. You see, hope is the waiting, anticipation, and expectation for God to deliver on his promises. Faith is the act of belief in those promises of God, that they're true. And he's saying, I've done both of those, God. I have built my life on your promises, and now I'm waiting for you to deliver on those promises. And so I'm going to, like in prayer, remind you of those promises. By the way, I'm a big believer in reminding God of his promises, right? In prayer, like, God, you said. Now, why is that, right? Is that because I think that God somehow forgot? God, you said. And God's like, well, that's not really what I said. Like, yes, you did. You said it. It's right here. And God's like, God, you said it in Psalm 27, verse 1. You would save me and shelter me. And God's like, oh, I did say that. Okay, all right, hold on. My bad. Let me get right on that. Is that why? No. When I in prayer say, God, but you said, it's not to remind God of something he's forgotten. It's to let God know that I haven't forgotten. God, I know that you said this. God, I've made decisions you said this is going to be true. I've made decisions as if that is true. And I'm telling you right now, I haven't forgotten it. God, I've come to you because you said that you would save me. God, I've come to you because you said that you would shelter me. And God, I want both of those things to be true, and I'm trusting and I'm waiting in anticipation and expectation for you to deliver on those promises. And by the way, for instance, in this case, that God will save you and he will shelter you. When you make those prayers, and God, I say, but you said, God, you said, he has the way in which he gets to fulfill those promises. Like how he fulfills those promises are up to him. There have been so many times where I've been like, God, but you said, and then he fulfills them. I'm like, not what I had anticipated, but yes, you're right. Thank you. I didn't see that coming, but yes, you're right. Because I think the other times what we do with prayer is say, God, I'm asking you to shelter me, and I'm asking you to save me, and here are the 5 appropriate ways in which you can do either one of those, right? Here, boom, boom. Because I know you need help up there, because I don't know how to do that. I've already made a list. So you don't need to worry about that. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in order of preference, right? And so I've even ordered them for you. So you just go, 1, I can do that. Then boom, we're done. You don't need to look at the other 4. But this is what we do. But really what God says, God he gets to decide how he will shelter us and comfort us, and then how he will deliver us. Those are up to him. I mean, anyone who's gone through the day of trouble and has been comforted by the Lord, you know that the comfort came from unlikely places in unlikely ways. Because he gets to fulfill his promises how he likes to fulfill his promises and how he wishes to. Charles Spurgeon says this. He says, referring to God, he gives us the best of shelter in the worst of danger. And I like that. He gives us the best of shelter in the worst of danger. And so he says, God, I've trusted you that you would shelter me, that you would save me. I will respond with worship, but I have not forgotten. Everyone's forsaken me, but you have not forsaken me. Verse 11. Teach me, O Lord, teach me your way, O Lord, and lead me on a level path because of my enemies. Give me not up to the will of my adversaries, for false witnesses have risen against me, and they breathe out violence. And so he says, God, to keep in the midst of my adversaries, keep my path straight. Give me not up to their will. That's where they keep me on this, lead me on the level path because of my enemies. So I've got these enemies, God, but keep me on the level path, and do not give me up to their will, for they are saying false things about me, and they're breathing out violence. I think that we are often shocked and surprised when our enemies lie about us and wish harm to come our way. Have you ever been shocked by that? They go, well, are they do they see you as an enemy? Yeah, they do see me as an enemy. Yeah. And they're lying about me. And they're wishing things harm would come my way. I go, yeah, that's probably why they're one of your enemies, right? I mean, that's like, I think at the end of the day, what we want are enemies that are just relatively indifferent towards us. Like, are they your enemy? Yes, they are my enemy, and they are indifferent towards me. Like, no, they're actively trying to harm me with their words and their actions. And I love what the psalmist David here says. He says, even though that's true, God, keep me on the level path. I mean, I don't know about you, but have you ever felt like you're rolling pretty good with God, and then like an enemy does something to you, and you're like, oh no, okay, God, hold on. I've been walking faithfully for a while now, but hold on for just a second, because I gotta go take care of some business. Because they keep on doing and saying these things, and I'm gonna do maybe some ungodly things back to them. But they deserve that. They deserve that. And I love what he says, even despite my enemies, despite the things that they say about me, despite what they're trying to do to me and what they wish upon me, keep me on the level path. Keep me in accordance with you. Don't make me go to the left or to the right. Too often in my own life and in your own life, you know this is true. Faithfully following God until somebody did something to you and they said something about you, and you're like, hold on. I'll be going to get back to the regularly scheduled program, but hold on just a second, because I got to go take care of some business. And he says, don't let that happen to me. And look what he says here then in verse 11 and 12. 13 and 14. He says, I believe that I shall look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord, be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait on the Lord. Let me read that again. I believe that I shall look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord, be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait on the Lord. Wait for the Lord. And so as he ends this psalm, he says, the probably a better translation it would have been, I believe, or I would have had absolute despair had I not thought that I would look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Like, I would have been totally despaired if I had thought that in this land, in this life, I would never see the goodness of God. And truth be told, I think that often Christians are in danger of falling into to one of two traps on the spectrum. Is that the goodness of God is all about the here and now. Like, and this would be like, God would never let anything harmful come your way, right? That's just God would never allow that, any sort of sickness or disease. If you have any sort of sickness or disease, it's because you lack in faith, because a good God would never let any sort of suffering happen to all of his people, because God is good God, and he loves his people, and his goodness is right now. And they sit in that, and I go, that's pretty far on the spectrum, because I think that God does certainly allow harm to come our ways. But the other end of the spectrum are people that are like, yeah, they're one-dayers. Like, yeah, one day when we get to heaven, everything's going to be right. One day when we get to heaven, then we get to experience the goodness of God. One day when we die a miserable death after a pitiful life, we will get to experience the goodness of God in heaven one day. And I go, here's the problem. That actually, so is that true? Like, yes, one day we'll be in the presence of Jesus, and like I said, it's more like a Garden of Eden state where we're back in his presence. Everything's, yes, absolutely. So then today we don't get to experience the goodness of God. I go, no, see, we're somewhere in between those two. Like the goodness of God is for this life. And even increasingly so in the life to come. But I think that so often because Christians are afraid of false hope, they expect nothing out of God today and only for God to do something one day. I go, no, actually I expect both. Why? Because he said to expect both. That's why. Not because I want to, I do want to expect both, but because he said you can. You ought to expect both. God, I expect you to be good today and in the future and tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that. And then one day when I die, Jesus, and I'm in your presence, then you're like fully good eternally, like unmitigated goodness for eternity. But I expect to see the goodness of God in the land of the living. And maybe that's a prayer you can call. God, you said, I can expect to see your goodness in the land of the living. God, I want to experience your goodness in the land of the living. But once again, he gets to define what that is. So then he says, then all of that, he wraps up with, so he says, basically, I'm going to summarize it. He goes, God, you are my salvation. You are my shelter. I will not respond in fear. I will respond in worship. And God, and I expect you to deliver on your promises in this life as well as the life to come, but in this life. And then he wraps up the whole thing with verse 14. Wait for the Lord, be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. Wait on God, be strong, take courage, wait on God. The psalmist tells the people of God to be patient. How do you do that? I mean, does he not know that we are in an instant gratification world? He says you need to be patient and wait on God. Isn't that just something that lazy people do that aren't willing to take it for themselves? Proactive people take things for themselves. They don't wait on anything. You don't wait on it. Don't wait on anything. That's lazy talk. You go out there and you take it. And I love that because this idea of waiting is often seen as passive and weak. But did you notice how he tied strength to that? Right? Wait on the Lord. Be strong. In other words, it's not the weak who wait on the Lord. It's the strong who wait on the Lord. And sometimes the reason why we don't wait on the Lord is because we are not strong enough. Oh, that we may be stronger. Some of the hardest work you will ever have to do is to wait on the Lord. And because a lot of times what happens is, God, I tried that for like a whole month, and then nothing happened. And so then I'm like, I'm going to do this now. I'm going to do it. And then we mess the whole thing up, and like, well, God, I don't know what you're doing now, because I waited on you for a month, you didn't show, and so then I took the reins, because only fools wait. I took the reins, and then I messed the whole thing up, and now I don't know what you're going to do now. And God's like, same thing. Wait on me. Some of the hardest work you'll ever have to do. You know, I say it takes strength that when your enemies say things about you to stay on course. It takes strength that when life turns sideways, you turn to God for salvation and sheltering. It takes strength that in the day of trouble that you respond in worship because you believe that your God will shelter you and save you. Waiting on the Lord is some of the hardest stuff you'll ever have to do. And so it's hope. It's hope when we seek him out for shelter. It's hope when we turn to him for salvation. It's hope when we call out to him in worship. When God shelters us, he will shelter us, and then he will save us, and then we will respond in worship. There's a connection between, remember I told you there's a connection between where you run to in the day of trouble and what you believe will shelter you and save you. But that's not just the problem. Because whatever shelters you and saves you ultimately is what's going to beg your worship. So if you can save yourself and shelter yourself, then guess at the end of the day, you're good enough. If your money can shelter you and save you, then at the end of the day, you will worship your money. If your job will save you and shelter you, you'll worship your job. If your family is what saves you and shelters you, then you will worship your family. In the day of trouble, where we run to tells us what we believe will save us and shelter us, and ultimately what saves us and shelters us will beckon our worship. And so what he says is that I will save you, that God will save you, and he will shelter you, he will deliver you, and then ultimately that you will you will respond with worship. And so therefore we get to be patiently hopeful and not fearfully anxious. Patiently hopeful and not fearfully anxious. Let me ask you this. Between patiently hopeful and fearfully anxious, which one do you experience more? Patiently hopeful must be nice. It is nice. Patiently hopeful or fearfully anxious. Because I think what's being offered to us is a patient hopefulness. What I want more of in my life is a patient hopefulness. That actually no matter what happens in the world, no matter what happens in the economy, or with policies or politicians, no matter what happens with the country or with world dynamics, no matter what happens there, I'm patiently hopeful. You know that we're waiting for the second advent, for Christ to return 2,000 years later. I can think of no better definition than patiently hopeful. Like I don't think we are any more or less expecting. I mean, we're just really, really wanting Jesus to return. And as a people, we've been patiently hopeful for 2,000 years. And may we continue to be so until he returns. But I think what happens often is that what we experience is a fearful anxiety when we think about the future. Because when we think about the future, what will shelter me and what will save me? Who's going to care for me and who's going to deliver me? That fearful anxiety is like, I don't know who that's going to be. And the psalmist says, it's God, and what we believe with Christmas is that it's Jesus. Do you know how Jesus says very similar things? Right, come to me all who you are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you what? I'll give you more burdens? No, I'll give you rest. He says, which one of you, by worrying about your life, has added anything to it? Why do you worry about tomorrow? Don't worry about tomorrow. Why is he don't worry about tomorrow, for today has enough troubles of its own, right? In other words, Jesus, it would have been nice if he would have said, hey, don't worry about tomorrow, because tomorrow's going to be amazing. He says, nah, tomorrow's a train wreck too, man. But worry about this train. Worry about this train wreck. You got a train wreck tomorrow too, that's fine. You'll figure that out then. But he said, but don't be. Why are you anxious? Why are you fearful? Be patiently hopeful, because you have a God who is outside of time, who's in control, and will deliver on all of his promises. And that's what we celebrate at Christmas. 700 years. And Jesus shows up. And Jesus shows up to shelter and to deliver his people. And our job is to trust in that and like the psalmist, respond in worship. And so my encouragement to you is that if you're not a Christian, is that you become a Christian, that you trust in Jesus, trust in Jesus for him to shelter you in the day of trouble. There's a judgment to come, judgment today, and that he would be the one who saves you. And that ultimately that your life would be an expression and a response to what he's done for you, and that of worship. If you are a Christian, may we be patiently hopeful people. May we stop being the herald of fearful anxiety. May we be the herald of patient hopefulness. Not because we trust in the world, but because we trust in our God. And he will deliver on all of his promises, and we wait with anticipation and expectation for him to do so. Let's pray. God, we thank you for your goodness. We thank you for your promises. God, and I pray that you would shelter us and save us. God, there are days of trouble that we're in. There are days of trouble that we're coming out of. There are days of trouble that await us. And in all of those places, may you be both our shelter and our salvation. May we look to the future with hopefulness, not because our world is great, but because you are. Not because even our country is good, but because you are. May our confidence be in you, because you're the one to save us and shelter us. And may we respond in worship. Jesus, we continue to be patiently hopeful for your return. May it be today. We continue to be patiently hopeful, knowing, not even hoping in the sense of wishful thinking, but knowing that you are going to return and you're going to come for us. And we thank you for that promise. We pray that we as a church, individually and collectively, that we would be in the echoes of all of those who have gone before us, in our proclamation that you will return, and we wait so patiently hopeful for it. We love you. We pray for these things in your name. Amen. Amen.